Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Katie, an instructor and facilitator at Sologic. I've spent the last decade helping teams walk through root cause analysis and FMEA in the real world settings, changing everything from industrial operations to complex organizational challenges. My background is in science and systems thinking, and I love translating technical concepts into practical tools teams can actually use. At Sologic, we work with organizations around the world to help them solve real problems using structured, evidence-based methods. We also publish free blogs, videos, and example problems like the human body FMEA you'll see today, so you can apply these ideas right away.
Hey everybody, I'm Sarah. I've been working in engineering and reliability for about 15 years, including time in a highly regulated and high-risk environment where failure just wasn't an option. My background's in manufacturing engineering, and I'm passionate about making structured problem solving practical and usable, not just something that looks good on paper. If you find these sessions useful, please feel free to share them with others in your field. We're starting with something a little bit new here in 2026. We're doing these monthly learning topics, and January's focus is on failure modes effects analysis. So you may have seen some of our most frequently asked FMEA questions that we posted on LinkedIn, along with some of their answers. We're also going to have a blog discussing FMEA in more detail on the process, but this webinar is going to be focused specifically on an FMEA example. So with that, let's get started.
Just a little bit about us. Sologic formed in 2012 and launched into software development shortly after that. We have offices all over the world with our global headquarters in Seattle, Washington. I'm coming to you from Savannah, Georgia.
And I'm joining from Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Here are some of the organizations that we work with. As you can see, it's a pretty varied list, but they all have one thing in common. They're all working to get better at problem solving, and we're helping them do that. Before we dive into our webinar today, a quick disclaimer. I am not a medical professional, and this is not medical advice. The human body is simply a familiar, intuitive asset that we're using to demonstrate the FMEA process. The goal here is to make the method easier to understand, not to make any clinical statements. So with that out of our way, we'll get started with what FMEA actually is.
Sure. So FMEA stands for Failure Modes and Effects Analysis. At its core, FMEA is a thinking tool. It's a structured way of asking what could fail, what would happen, and what should we do about it. It helps teams to identify how components or subsystems might fail. It helps teams to understand the impact of those failures. And then finally, to prioritize which risks deserve attention. Most importantly, though, FMEA is proactive. It looks ahead to try to figure out what can we do differently. It's not about waiting for the failure, it's about anticipating it. There are many ways to structure FMEA, but most follow a similar core process. Now, I don't know about you, but when I am making a new meal or a new dish, I like to follow a recipe the first few times that I make it to make sure it comes out delicious in exactly the way I want it. A recipe is really just a process. It keeps you organized, consistent, and on track. FMEA is the same way. Until the FMEA process becomes second nature, following a proven structure helps us to stay focused. It helps us to avoid skipping steps and to produce a consistent, high quality result. A typical FMEA process includes, and you'll see that on the screen here, defining our scope and our boundaries. Then we want to break down the asset into systems and components. We call this our asset hierarchy. We want to define the primary functions of those systems and components. We're going to identify individual failures and causes, evaluate risk, and deciding actions. The spreadsheet that we'll walk through today follows this same logic, just in a practical, facilitator-friendly format that helps teams stay structured and aligned. But before we get into the spreadsheet, it's important to understand the core questions that drive this process. So as we transition to the next slide on here, at the heart of FMEA, at the heart of our method, are 7 foundational questions that guide the entire process. These 7 questions are really the backbone of FMEA. They're simple on the surface, but together they force a team to think systemically about how a system actually behaves, not how we wish it behaved. So, we're going to walk through these questions and talk about why each is so critical to the process. So, Katie, our first question on here is what should it do? Can you tell us why this is our starting point?
Yeah, it's all about aligning the team on expectations. You'd be surprised how often teams skip this and assume everyone agrees.
Then, our next question, how could it fail?
That question expands the conversation beyond catastrophic failures to include degraded performance, delays, or reduced capacity.
Up next, what would cause that failure?
This is where we list credible failure modes: physical, human, procedural, and organizational. This is where having subject matter experts on the FMEA team is imperative to answering this question. Those who operate and maintain the equipment will have the best insights.
Number 4 on our list is what would happen if it failed? And I think this is where we learn so much from our teams.
Exactly. This question helps us describe observable effects. What do operators, customers, or systems, what would they notice if something failed?
Now we are to one of the most important questions in this process. Why would that matter?
Because not all failures are created equal. Some impact safety, which is usually a top priority for most organizations. Some impact production, and some just impact overall convenience or cost.
Our final questions on here, we ask how could we prevent or detect it? And if we can't, what's our backup plan? Which I think
Yeah.
is where people tend to skip ahead in an FMEA. They believe they already have the answer, but there's so much more we can learn.
Yep, I totally agree. That's where proactive maintenance, monitoring, design changes, and contingency planning comes into play.
So, Katie, with your experience with FMEAs, can you tell me what goes well or not well for organizations and people that are doing FMEA?
Yeah, good question. In my experience, teams are usually very good at questions 2 and 3, the failure modes and the causes. That's what we see every day in the world. But they often skip questions 1, 5, and 7. And those skipped questions are often where the biggest insights and decisions actually live. And so the technical answers to all of these questions get captured in a living document, usually a spreadsheet, which we'll walk through the example in a little bit.
So, we have this FMEA process and we have these questions that are critical for asking in order to complete the FMEA. But what makes something an asset? We typically see FMEA performed to improve reliability of equipment, but we're going to demo an FMEA on the human body. So, Katie, can you talk to me about how different types of assets, like what they are and how this might work?
Yeah. Usually when we do these projects, we usually do these on some piece of equipment at a company. And so me having a science background, I wanted to do an example that was interesting to me. And I'm not even sure how this exactly came up, but I just thought the human body. It's something we can all relate to, right? We all have one. And it actually breaks down into systems and components just like anything else. So really, FMEAs can be done on any kind of asset. And I try to think of just 3 very different examples, or just 3 totally different things, right? A biological system, the human body; a technological system, our home Wi-Fi network; or a mechanical system, an industrial pump. The third is most likely what you're going to see in your day-to-day occupational FMEAs, but at the end of the day, these things look nothing alike, but they all break down into systems and components. The body has the cardiovascular, respiratory, nervous systems, and others. A Wi-Fi home network has data supply, routing, signal transmission systems, and pumps have hydraulic, drive, and sealing systems. So here's the key takeaway here. FMEA is not about the asset, it's about how we break down and understand the asset systems. And just to dive a little bit more into the human body naturally breaks into systems, like I said, just like any engineered asset. Each system has components, functions, and potential failure modes. I think any of us at any point in our life has dealt with at least one failure mode with our body. And just like industrial systems, failures in one system often affect others. For example, poor oxygen delivery affects the brain, it can affect the muscles, or it can affect the heart, just to name a few. This interconnectedness is exactly what FMEA is designed to help us understand. So now I'm going to switch to the human body FMEA spreadsheet and show how we translated this system's view into an actual FMEA table.
And I will interrupt her with questions that our stakeholders would be likely to ask.
Yeah, please do, Sarah. That's where the good learning happens. So what I want you to see here is the structure of the FMEA, not the human biology details. Across the bottom, you'll notice several different worksheets. These are just best practices, right? We've got the versions worksheet where we'll keep up with the different versions 1, 2, 3 as we work. It's a good idea to capture your team information. We've got the FMEA worksheet. Again, this is the bread and butter of this whole workbook. And then we've got several others that I will explain in a few. But this spreadsheet mirrors how we facilitate real FMEAs with clients, starting with structure, then functions, failures, risk, and final decisions.
So you can think of this as a template that you can adapt directly for your own components or your own assets or systems. While we have not done an FMEA on the human body for a client, we thought that the human body just makes for an intuitive example.
Right. So if we take a look, first things first, we want to define that asset hierarchy. Here we've broken the human body into systems. I'm going to scroll through, but you can see we've got the cardiovascular system, which includes the heart, blood vessels, the blood. If I scroll down a little bit further, we've got the nervous subsystem, which includes the spinal cord, peripheral nerves, sensory receptors. Then we go into the muscular skeletal subsystem that includes joints, bones, muscles. We've got the digestive subsystem, the endocrine, and so on. The spreadsheet's got quite a few rows in it. This is exactly what you do for a pump, a process unit, or any piece of equipment. So if you skip this step, everything downstream becomes inconsistent.
Yeah, if the hierarchy is not aligned with your system or your boundaries, everything downstream is going to be wrong. This is one of our most critical facilitation steps when we are leading these for clients. When we're doing an actual FMEA with a client, we'll try to create this hierarchy of what the components is, but then one of our first touch points with the client is to ensure that this is accurate.
Right, so again, this worksheet is the heart of the FMEA. So each row represents a component and a failure scenario. And I'm going to walk through a few columns. After we do the asset hierarchy, then we start to list our primary functions, what the component should do. Then we define the functional failure, how it could fail to meet that expectation. Then we do potential failure modes. Let me scooch down a little bit. Failure modes describe how that failure could happen. And then we talk about failure effects, describes how, or excuse me, what happens locally and at the system level.
I think what we see a lot here, Katie, at this point is teams will often jump straight to the solutions. But fully describing the failure first, that's where a lot of our learning gets to happen in this process.
Yeah. After we've done the asset hierarchy, after we've talked about the failure modes and effects, next we score severity, probability, and detectability, giving us our RPM or our risk priority number. And so severity alone, which again, let me scooch over a little bit. Severity alone does not define risk. We also have to evaluate probability and detectability. They matter just as much. So one thing I do want to point out here, before you kick off the FMEA, it's so important to define your severity, probability, and detectability ranking scale. Here are real tables that we use with definitions for each number on the scale. And basically, what this does is it prevents the common problem where everything becomes a 9 or a 10. I do want to say one disclaimer. I have seen these tables be on a scale from 1 to 5. It is honestly just a personal preference of mine to go all the way up to 10. I prefer to have 10 rankings, I guess, to give you that granularity instead of just 5.
Now you said that these are generic tables, but where does this information come from?
Right. So this came from the Reliability Bible, which is John Mowbray's Reliability Centered Maintenance. I don't know if you can see this book, but he gives you guidance in this book. And so we have adapted these tables from this book. Absolutely, a client can copy and paste this as is, but I would suggest modifying it to your business. So for one client, we actually have to adjust the scale for different pieces of equipment. For example, some pieces of equipment just have very rare failure occurrences. So this 1 through 3 down here under the occurrence ranking in the middle doesn't give us the granularity we need. We have to actually expand that out to 1 in 10 years, which will then adjust the rest of the numbers as well. But that occurrence rating is just what makes sense for that piece of equipment. So again, to answer your question, these are a great starting point. You can definitely copy and paste them, but I would suggest looking at this scale and seeing if it makes sense to your business.
Yeah, I think this is huge for our facilitators, and for leading an FMEA, because that way you get the alignment and you don't have everybody with their own mental scale as they're evaluating the severity, the occurrence, and the detection.
Great. So now that we've walked through the overall kind of organization of the FMEA workbook, now we're going to go through 2 examples. I have to go through and find my highlighted example. So the first is actually going to be this row 48, the esophagus. I like this one because everyone understands swallowing, and most people have experienced when it doesn't quite work right. The system here is the digestive system, and the component is the esophagus. The function of the esophagus is to move foods and liquids from the mouth to the stomach. The functional failure is difficulty swallowing, which means it's not meeting that expectation. And then the failure mode describes how that failure could happen. For example, impaired or disrupted movement of food through the esophagus. I think we've all experienced this where maybe, I know for me, sometimes I get a little excited. I might be trying to talk while I eat and I swallow and it just doesn't quite feel right. Doesn't feel like it's going down all the way. So then the effects is this stuck sensation. Food may get stuck, a person may cough, worst case scenario, they may choke. And so then we want to score this risk. So for these particular examples, this is overall low risk. Severity is moderate, it's uncomfortable, it can be dangerous, but not instantly catastrophic. Probability is also moderate, as this can happen fairly commonly. And detectability is usually pretty good because people notice when they can't swallow normally. In fact, we've got this universal choking sign. So this is an acute, obvious failure. People notice it immediately, and the impact is immediate and visible. If you are indeed choking, hopefully somebody is around and they will give you the Heimlich maneuver. Now let's go look at another chronic example, something that's just a little bit different. So this one we're going to do joint degradation. This is where FMEA becomes really powerful. The system here is the musculoskeletal. The component is the joints. The function of the joint is to allow smooth and controlled movement between bones. The functional failure is reduced joint mobility or painful movement. The failure mode is degeneration of joint surfaces over time. This is not a sudden break, but a slow wear and tear. And the effects of this might be stiffness, pain, reduced mobility, and eventually loss of function. But this happens gradually, often over years. So when we score This one is a little bit higher risk. Severity is moderate. It affects quality of life, but is rarely immediately life-threatening. Probability is high because joint degeneration is extremely common over time. Detectability is often low early on because people adapt, compensate, and normalize these symptoms. And this is a classic chronic failure, not dramatic, but high exposure over time and often higher risk than sudden dramatic events. So it got a little bit higher of a risk priority scale. So ideally, after you do each row's severity, occurrence, and detectability, you get this RPM number. You'd want to come and sort on this column so that you get the highest risk events up top. And then you get to look at that list, and then it's up to each organization to decide how they're going to mitigate these. Again, because I'm not a doctor or medical professional, I don't have the rest of this spreadsheet filled out, but ideally you'd like to come up with recommended actions. You want to make sure that you assign it to a specific person or position title, and you want to give it a due date at the very least so that you can then um, roll out these action items to give you overall reduced risk. Now, we understand that your list, let's see how long this one is. I'm guessing it's well over 100. Your list is typically over 100. Yep, we are going to keep on going. Let's see. 141 failure modes. So you are going to accept the risk for some of these. Some of this risk is determined to be low. And as long as we go into this with our eyes wide open and we accept that risk level, that's okay. The whole point of this is to have a methodical approach to identify those high risk items so that you can mitigate for them. So the key takeaway here is that the structure matters more than the asset details. This same approach applies to pumps, processes, IT systems, and organizations. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up. Thank you all for spending time with us today and walking through the human body FMEA example. We hope this made the FMEA process feel more practical and approachable to your own systems.
If you'd like to stay connected with Sologic, you can scan the QR code on the slide to follow our LinkedIn page. We share practical resources, example problems, upcoming training opportunities, webinar announcements. They're all on our LinkedIn and on our website. For our monthly learning topics, February is going to focus on going in depth into root cause analysis. There will be more Q&A as well as discussion and examples. Also, of course, you can connect with Katie or with me directly on LinkedIn as well. And
Please
we're
do.
always happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, and if you'd like help facilitating an RCA, building an FMEA, or strengthening your reliability program, feel free to email us. We love to support your team and help out.
So yeah, our contact information's on this slide. Don't hesitate to reach out, and thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks again, and we hope to work with you soon. Have a good rest of your day.